The road to St. Mortru Abbey was never marked on any official map, not even in the oldest monastic registries. It existed as a rumor, an unfolding, as the peasants in the valley called it, appearing only to those who sought something they should not. Some claimed it was a curse, others a test. Most simply avoided the hills entirely, whispering that the clouds above them always moved in the opposite direction of the wind. The historian, Cassian Vale, had spent years chasing phantoms through Europe's forgotten ruins, but even he felt a faint unease as he ascended the last stretch of the path. His boots sank into the soil, soft as if freshly turned by a gravedigger's spade. The trees leaned inward, heavy with winter rot, their branches warped like hands reaching for confession. It had rained 3 days prior, leaving the air tasting of iron and wet stone. Cassian paused at the top of the rise. There it was, St. Mortru, or what remained of it. The abbey lay in a shallow cradle of fog, its broken towers rising like ribs from a corpse. Vines strangled the outer walls, creeping into shattered windows and pushing aside cracked stones. A single bell survived atop the western spire, green with rust and shaped by centuries of storms. It swayed ever so slightly, though no wind touched it. Cassian exhaled slowly, trying to steady the shiver climbing his spine. The abbey had been abandoned for more than 400 years. Its last monks vanished under circumstances that had never been recorded officially. Only in apocryphal letters, written with hurried strokes, smudged as if the scribes trembled, was a place even acknowledged. A single phrase repeated across all the accounts. Here lies the book that should never be read. Cassian tightened his cloak and descended into the fog. The main doors hung open, though it's swollen and warped but still displaying the ornate carvings of saints and penitents. Their faces were gouged out, each hollowed down to bare lines. He brushed his hand over one of the deeper grooves. The marks didn't look like weathering. They were too precise, too purposeful, as if someone had removed the eyes and mouths with reverence. All fear. Inside, the air was cold enough to sting. Dust hung in pale shafts of light that pierced through gaps in the roof like divine fingers. Cassian's footsteps echoed across the stones, disturbingly loud in the silent expanse. The chapel was vast yet suffocating, every alcove shrouded in gloom. He inhaled deeply. There was something else beneath the dust, the faintest scent of tallow and incense, impossibly fresh, as though the candles had only just been extinguished. His heart pulsed a little faster. He followed the central aisle. Fallen pews formed jagged silhouettes. The altar was overturned. Its marble slab cracked down the center like a split skull. A tapestry depicting St. Valerius lay torn on the ground, the saint's halo shredded into frayed threads. Cassian resisted the urge to look over his shoulder. The abbey felt inhabited, not by the living, but by memory. Every shadow seemed coiled with intention. Past the nave, he found the stairwell leading down to the scriptorium. This was a place of rumors. This was where scribes once labored in candlelit silence to produce manuscripts forbidden by church and crown alike. Records of heresies, confessions sealed by death, documents of hunger, ritual, plague, and other matters unfit for any sanctioned archive. Cassian's breath clouded as he descended. The steps groaned but held. At the bottom, a corridor stretched into darkness, the air thick with a musk of old parchment. The historian lit his lantern, its flame illuminating a scattering of bones on the floor, likely small animals that had crept inside. Their arrangement was peculiar, set in spirals, circles, and uneven rings, as if positioned deliberately. But by whom? Oh, what? He pressed forward. The corridor led to an arched doorway carved with Latin scripture. The words were nearly illegible, but Cassian recognized the phrase after a moment of study. Cui legit plurat he who reads, weeps. His pulse hammered. Beyond the door lay the scriptorium. It was less damaged than the upper floors. Long tables still stood, though coated in thick dust. Ink pots lay overturned, broken quills scattered like feathers from a plucked bird. Shelves sagged under the weight of rotting manuscripts. Most unreadable, their vellum pages fused into stiff slabs. Cassian set his lantern on one of the tables. He began searching. He knew exactly what he was looking for. The Codex, the rumored tome, the Book of the 12. a manuscript so feared that medieval chroniclers omitted its name, referring to it only through symbols or euphemism, the sinewed codex, the unclean ledger, the chronicle of breathless sins. Cassian had spent a decade trying to confirm its existence. Now, as he moved through the shelves, an unsettling sensation crept into him, something between anticipation and dread, like a whisper brushing his ear, urging him forward. Half an hour passed in silence. Then he saw it. A box, wooden, sealed with iron clasps, resting alone on a high shelf in the back alcove. It looked untouched by time. No mold, no dust, as if it had been placed there only moments before. Cassian's throat tightened. He reached up, fingers trembling, and pulled the box down. It was surprisingly warm. He set it on the table, wiped away the thin sheen of moisture that had formed on the lid, and unlatched the clasps. They opened with a clean metallic snap, sharp and precise, like the first cut of a scalpel. Inside lay a book wrapped in black cloth. The cloth glistened faintly. He unfolded it. The breath left him in a single, involuntary gasp. The codex was bound in skin. Not leather, not vellum. Human skin, unmistakable in its texture, its pores, the faint tracery of veins beneath the surface. The cover was smooth, almost polished, as though it had been lovingly cared for. A sigil was etched into the surface, a circle divided into 12 uneven segments, each marked with an archaic symbol. Cassian reached out and touched the cover. Warm. Alive. A tremor rippled beneath his fingertips, subtle but real. He snatched his hand back. The lantern flickered violently. Shadows danced along the walls, warping into shapes that seemed implausibly elongated. Arms, spines, figures hunched in supplication or hunger. For a moment, Cassian felt as though the scriptorium was filled with silent watchers, kneeling around him in a ring. He swallowed hard. The historian in him, a creature forged from discipline and obsession, stepped forward where the fearful man hesitated. He opened the book. The first page was blank except for a single sentence, inked in red. To read the 12 is to join them. Cassian turned the page. The parchment crinkled with a sound disturbingly reminiscent of breath. The second page displayed the title, Liber Duodecim, the Book of the 12 Taboos. Beneath it, a line of smaller script, gathered from the forbidden annals of Europe, sealed by decree, guarded by silence. Cassian felt his heart beat in his throat. He turned to the third page. A list of 12 chapter headings filled the parchment, each written in archaic Latin. He recognized a few phrases immediately, prohibitions related to lineage, ritual, flesh, sanctity, and desire, taboos so profound that even their euphemism carried a weight of dread through medieval society. But these were not written as moral warnings. They were documented as events. Cassian's pulse quickened. He leaned closer. The ink looked fresh. His breath fogged the page. Another sensation flickered at the edge of his awareness, the faint feeling of something moving behind him. He froze, listening. Only the soft crackle of the lantern flame broke the silence. But the shadows seemed nearer than before. Cassian turned the page again. This one held no text, only an illustration. A monastery, St. Mortru itself, drawn in meticulous detail, far too precise for its supposed era. The tower, the chapel, even the cracks in the stone were identical to what he had seen above. At the bottom of the illustration was a caption, where the 12 was sealed and where the 13th waits. Cassian frowned. 13th? His research had never mentioned the 13th. He looked closer. As he studied the illustration, the shadows in the drawing seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, light altering, lines rearranging. But after a few moments, he noticed something impossible. A small figure now stood in the foreground, a man holding a lantern. Cassian recoiled. His own likeness stared back at him from the page. The lantern beside him dimmed. Something behind him shifted. He did not turn. He could not. His hand shook as he flipped the next page. Words filled this one, dense script, translated from older sources, describing the abbey's fall. The monks had not abandoned it willingly. They had been consumed by their work transcribing the Book of the 12, their minds unraveling with every forbidden tale they copied. Witnesses described hearing chanting at night, rhythmic like breathing. Some claimed the walls themselves pulsed. Others insisted the book whispered. Cassian realized he was gripping the codex too tightly. He forced himself to breathe, releasing his hold. The scriptorium felt colder. He read on. The next entry described disappearances, villagers pulled from their homes, nobles vanishing from locked chambers, children found wandering miles from their homes in trance-like states, murmuring indistinct phrases about the veiled ones and the rooms beneath the roots of the world. A steady dread pulled in Cassian's stomach. He turned the page. Another illustration. This one showed 12 silhouettes arranged around a central circle. Their forms were vague, twisted, stretched, masked, crowned, shrouded, but each exuded a distinct aura of ritual significance. Their identities were nameless, but their roles unmistakable. Taboos given human form. The scriptorium seemed constrict around him, the walls tightening like a throat swallowing. Then he noticed a circle drawn between the figures. It was empty, but below it, a caption. The seat of the 13th remains open. Cassian felt something drip down the back of his neck. Water? Sweat? Blood? He resisted the urge to touch it. The shadows shifted again, this time unmistakably. They weren't random flickers. They were turning toward him. Cassian forced his gaze back to the book. The next page was handwritten, its ink darker, thicker, a description of an unnamed taboo, one feared beyond all others. The texts were fragmented, as though the scribe's hand had spasmed mid-sentence. Words trailed off. Letters overlapped. A single line stood clear. He who reads the 12 becomes the 13th. Cassian's heart lurched. He tried to close the book. It would not move. The pages clung to his fingers, warm and pulsing. The shadows surrounding him deepened into humanoid shapes, not fully formed, but suggestive. Cloaked outlines, masked faces, bodies twisted by ritual binding and ancient vows. Cassian backed away from the table. The book remained open. Its pages fluttered as though caught in a wind, though the air in the room was still. The silhouette stepped closer. One reached out a long, trembling hand, pointing at him. Cassian stumbled, lantern nearly tipping. The codex snapped shut. The silhouettes vanished instantly, as though sucked back into the walls. The scriptorium fell silent. Cassian stood trembling, breath ragged. The only sound was the faint echo of the codex settling back into stillness. He approached it slowly. The sigil on the cover glowed faintly. A warmth radiated from it, not comforting, but hungry. Cassian exhaled. Despite everything, fear, warning, instinct, he reached out and opened the book once more. The first chapter title appeared in crisp red ink, I Developmento Corporis, of the Veiling of the Body. As he read the first line, the lantern extinguished. The shadows around him leaned in and listened. The first chapter dissolved into the lantern-smothering dark with a weight Cassian could feel pressing against his ribs. Even without light, the codex remained visible, its pages shimmering with a faint, organic luminescence, like a creature breathing beneath its skin. Shadows avoided it, bowing away as though repelled by a presence older than stone. Cassian's lungs tightened as he leaned closer. On the open page, primitive script crawled like living tendrils. Of the veiling of the body, the first taboo, born in silence and perfected in darkness. He ran a fingertip along the margin. The ink was warm. The text began like a monastic chronicle, but its tone, urgent, breathless, betrayed the scribe's fraying sanity. To conceal the body was to protect the soul. To hide the body was to deny its storms. To erase the body was to banish its hungers. Cassian swallowed. This was no ordinary treatise on monastic modesty. As he read on, the word descended into a labyrinth of rituals crafted to extinguish every physical impulse. Monks and nuns were trained to move without sound, breathe without drawing attention, sleep with arms tightly bound, and keep every inch of flesh covered, even in solitude, even in prayer. He turned the page, and the air shifted. A cold breath spiraled up from beneath the table, brushing his wrist like fingers tasting his pulse. The chapter continued. The veiling began with cloth but ended with silence. Cassian exhaled sharply as a manuscript illustrated the practice. Drawn figures wrapped in layers upon layers of heavy linen. Drenched in incense, their features erased by tight bindings. Only their eyes remained uncovered, and even these appeared hollow, the pupils painted black. This was not ordinary modesty. This was erasure. The scribe wrote that the practice started in the 11th century after an abbess of St. Isoline claimed to hear the movements of the body whispering sins. She believed that sensuality was not an action but a sound, a rustle of cloth, a shift of weight, a breath too sharp, too human. To silence the body was to silence temptation. Within a decade, dozens of houses had adopted the same practices. Within a century, the rituals had mutated. Cassian read descriptions of monks who wrapped their torsos so tightly they bruised, of nuns who sewed veils around their wrists to prevent wandering touch, of devotional chambers padded with wool so that no breath, however sharp or desperate, could be heard. But the manuscript hinted at something else, something unrecorded in official histories, a hidden room, a place where silence became worship. Cassian felt the temperature around him drop. The next page was a full illustration, a cloister, but not like any surviving medieval example. The arches were narrow and crooked, forcing the figures inside to hunch. Veiled bodies knelt motionless in the courtyard, their shadows elongated grotesquely, stretching toward a darkened doorway at the far end. A doorway marked with a symbol Cassian recognized, a circle divided into 12 crooked segments. His pulse quickened. He touched the illustration and immediately regretted it. The ink pulsed. The cloister figures shifted. For one impossible heartbeat, their veils fluttered as though stirred by breath. Cassian jerked his hand back. The lantern, which had gone out earlier, sputtered weakly into a sickly glow, as if the codex exhaled light into it. The scriptorium brightened just enough to reveal movement at the edge of his vision. He kept reading. The text became more frantic. When the veil covered the flesh, the mind wandered. When the mind wandered, shadows came. They came as guardians at first, then as witnesses. By the end, they were the only ones who listened. Cassian's skin prickled. The scribe described monks who claimed that after weeks of sensory deprivation, they felt presences sitting beside them in their cells, entities shaped like their own bodies, but taller, darker, their linen wrappings whispering against the stones. At first, these presences only watched. But soon they began imitating the monks' movements, kneeling when they knelt, rising when they rose, turning their heads in perfect unison. The manuscript called them the cloistered echoes. As Cassian read on, he became hyper-aware of the room around him, the tick of dripping water, the faint creak of ancient timbers shifting overhead, the whisper of his own breath. Every noise sounded amplified, exposed, as though the abbey itself strained to hear him. He turned the page. This one bore confession. It was a personal account, written in a trembling hand. We sealed Sister Marianne's cell yesterday, 3 weeks into the veiling. No sound was heard from within, none at all, but when we opened the door at dawn. The sentence stopped. Cassian's mouth went dry. He slid his thumb beneath the page and turned it slowly. The next page was different. The parchment was thicker, stiffer, the ink darker, clotted in places like dry blood. At the top was a crude sketch, Sister Marianne's cell. The door stood open. The bedding was undisturbed. The walls were marked with dozens of handprints, but no hands had formed them. They were too long, the fingers too thin, the spacing too wide. Beneath the drawing, the scribe continued. Where we placed her, she was gone. Where she prayed, something else remained. Cassian felt an icy ripple crawl along his arms. Unexpectedly, his lantern brightened, casting long, gaunt shadows across the walls. And for an instant, just an instant, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a silhouette that seemed to recoil from the light, its outline ragged, as though made of strips of cloth caught in a windless draught. He did not turn. He forced himself to keep reading. The narrative shifted again. The scribe now chronicled the descent of an entire cloister into ritualistic mania. Veiling became obsession. Not even the face was left uncovered. Monks wrapped their heads entirely, leaving small perforations for sight. Nuns wore gloves sewn to their sleeves so tightly their fingers went numb. Some bound their knees to prevent certain movements. Others filled their ears with wax to bind the temptations of sound. The more they concealed, the more the shadows grew. Cassian traced the words, each line dripping with fear. The more we silenced ourselves, the more we heard them. Their footfalls in the nave, their breath against our veils, their bodies stitching themselves into the spaces between us. Cassian's breath caught. He looked toward the far edge of the room. There, by the toppled shelf, something stood, tall, wrapped from head to toe in what looked like layers of ancient linen, its face entirely veiled, its posture perfectly still. Cassian blinked. It vanished, or perhaps it had never been there. His hands trembled as he turned the next page. A new illustration. This time, it was a procession, veiled figures moving through a dim corridor, each holding a candle whose flame curved inward, as if drawn toward their bodies rather than the air. They were entering a chamber marked with the same 12-segmented sigil. Inside that chamber, a massive shape loomed, something neither human nor entirely spectral, its form rippling beneath fold of cloth that seemed to move of their own accord. Cassian's stomach tightened. At the bottom of the illustration, the caption, "Silence birth hunger, and hunger birth him who raps." Cassian exhaled shakily. He continued. The scribe described the entity, the veiled emanation, as a presence formed not from desire itself, but from its suppression. The monks believed that every stifled impulse gathered like smoke, collecting in the cloister's sealed chambers until it coalesced into a sentient mass of longing and restraint twisted together. He read the chilling line, "We bound our bodies, but not our shadows." Cassian pressed a hand to his sternum, feeling his heartbeat quicken. The scriptorium seemed smaller, the air thicker, the shadows heavier. He read, "At night we heard him at the door. At dawn, we found our veils disturbed." Cassian's mouth went dry. He could almost feel cloth brushing against his neck. He continued reading, pushing fear aside with academic obsession. The chapter became darker still. It recounted how the cloister finally collapsed, not from external attack, but from within. The veiled emanation whispered through linen wrappings, calling individuals into the sealed chamber one by one. They entered willingly, in trances, believing they would transcend bodily limitations. The others found their veils abandoned outside the chamber, laid neatly in rows like discarded skins. The bodies were never recovered. Cassian's fingers tightened around the page. He swallowed. The next entry was brief. "We should have burned the chamber, but by then it had learned to imitate us." A cold breath skittered across the back of Cassian's neck. He whipped around. The room was empty. His pulse pounded. He turned back to the codex. The final paragraph described the scribe's last days. He wrote of figures lurking at the edge of vision, their wrappings fluttering without wind, of soft footfalls following him down the corridors, of waking to find his own veil tied tight to each night than he remembered binding it. The last lines were jagged, barely legible. "I hear him now, the rustle of his endless cloth, and I know the silent ones wait behind me." To veil is to surrender. To hide the body is to reveal the hunger. To be unseen is to be found. The entry ended abruptly. No signature. No explanation. Just a smear of ink dragged toward the bottom of the page, as if the scribe's hand had been yanked away mid-sentence. Cassian stared at the smear. His skin prickled. Then, rustle. Very soft. Very precise. Behind him, Cassian froze. Slowly, he turned. A silhouette stood at the far end of the scriptorium. Tall, motionless, wrapped in veils that moved without wind. Cassian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The veiled figure tilted its head, slowly, with unnatural grace, its movements so fluid they seemed boneless. The cloth around its face tightened, as if something beneath it leaned forward to listen. Cassian stumbled back into the table. The codex snapped shut. Darkness swallowed the room. For a moment, there was only the soft whisper of fabric shifting across stone. Then silence, not the absence of sound, a presence of silence, heavy, intentional, watching. Cassion's breath stuttered in his throat. The lantern flared back to life, dim but steady. The figure was gone, but the faint scent of tallow and ancient cloth lingered. And on the cover of the codex, a new symbol had appeared, so faint it might have been overlooked, yet unmistakable. A single strip of linen, drawn taut, waiting. Cassian closed his eyes, exhaled through clenched teeth, and opened the book to the next chapter, hands trembling. 2. The sanguine linear of the bloodlines unsealed. The shadows around him leaned closer, listening, always listening. The page Cassian turned was heavier than the others, as though saturated with something thicker than ink, memory, perhaps, or the weight of too many unspoken generations. The codex shuddered faintly beneath his touch, as if reluctant to reveal this particular chapter. Shadows recoiled from the parchment's pale glow. The air around him thickened with the scent of old stone and colder secrets. At the top of the page, written in jagged red script, was a title, 2. The sanguine linear of the bloodlines unsealed. Cassian inhaled slowly, steadying his breath. This chapter looked older than the previous ones, not merely aged, but ancient, as if copied from sources that predated the Abbey itself. Margins held cramped annotations, the handwriting shifting abruptly between careful monastic script and frantic scratches that looked like the last desperate scribbles of hands that did not want to be writing. The first lines crawled across the page like roots from a poisonous tree. The hunger for heirs forged sickness from desire, and so the noble houses turned inward, folding upon themselves like dying stars. Cassian exhaled, the lantern flickering weakly at his side. The manuscript began with an account of House Veon, a once proud family whose land stretched across the marshlands of the south. Their chronicles spoke of a curse. Every firstborn son died before reaching adulthood, and every daughter vanished into a madness described politely in royal registries as melancholia but whispered among servants as a calling of the mirror blood. In desperation, Lord Everett Veon sealed his keep. For 7 years, no outsider was allowed inside, no member of the house emerged. Messengers delivered food and supplies through iron slots in the gate. Letters were received but never answered. Servants who accompanied deliveries murmured of eerie rituals, voices chanting in unison, the sound of stones grinding, the echo of footsteps that did not match the number of family members known to live inside. When the gates finally opened, House Veon presented an heir, a boy of pale hair and darker, fathomless eyes. The peasants called him the child of still water. Cassian felt a tremor pass through him as a manuscript described the child. Not explicitly. Nothing in the codex was explicit, but the implication was thick, heavy, suffocating. The lineage had folded inward, the blood made to contain itself in a grotesque act of desperation and pride. The boy grew strangely. He never blinked. He never aged, at least not visibly. At 13, he appeared no older than 6. His skin stretched too tightly over his bones, and his limbs seemed almost fluid when he moved, as though the body was not finished, or perhaps unfinished on purpose. Rumors swelled like plague boils. Servants whispered of nightly screams echoing from the whole of portraits. Architects claimed the keep's layout had changed. Walls had shifted. Stairwells looped into dead ends. The nursery moved places overnight. The codex wrote, "Where blood turns upon itself, form unravels, and what unravels, hungers." Cassian felt the words in his bones. He read on. The manuscript then turned to House Drouville, known historically for their iron minds and their colder hearts. Their archives were notoriously incomplete because of family control which history survived. Yet the codex preserved what official chronicles would not. It described a winter so brutal that the rivers froze solid for months. Famine devoured the countryside. House Drouville, desperate for a successor to maintain their holdings after 3 heirs died under mysterious circumstances, sealed their inner chambers and forbade all servants from entering the family wing. One maid disobeyed. Her testimony, written here by an anonymous monk, was found on a scrap of vellum hidden inside a reliquary years later. Cassian read her words, his breath catching as he imagined the trembling hand that wrote them. The torches were out, but something glowed. something within the walls. I heard whispers, like a mirror speaking to itself, and I saw shadows where no one walked. The family moved in one shape, their limbs touching, their breaths shared, as though they were a single body split into many parts. Cashin's skin crawled. The note ended abruptly. Do not open the door. Do not say the family name. Do not look into their eyes. The historian's throat tightened. He glanced around the scriptorium, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a pair of eyes watching him from behind a broken shelf. Dark, still, inhumanly patient. He blinked. Gone. He forced his attention back to the page. The codex continued with the story of House Marrowcrest, whose obsession with purifying the lineage had led to ritual conducted in a hexagonal chamber beneath their keep. The chamber was lined with mirrors, all facing inward. According to the manuscript, the mirrors were not for reflection, but for containment. Contained within them was something the chronicler only described as the child who was not a child, and the parent who was not a parent, bound together by breath and bone, refusing to separate. Cassian tried to picture this, but felt his stomach twist. The scribe elaborated. Their lineage thickened, the blood turning to clay, the faces merging in generations. They did not see each other as separate, and so the shadows ceased to separate as well. Cassian exhaled slowly, cold sweat prickling down his spine. These were no simple tales of forbidden kinship. These were accounts of what happened when human lineage was pushed beyond breaking. When desperation melted identity, when blood circled back on itself until a line deformed in mind, form, and spirit. He turned the page. A full illustration covered it. 12 noble crests, distorted versions of known heraldry, interlocked in a circle. Some were cracked. Some were smeared beyond recognition. But one crest in the center was unmistakable. The symbol Cassian had seen on the codex cover. A circle of 12 divisions. The caption beneath. The 12 houses who turned inward. The 12 who fed themselves to themselves. Cashin's chest tightened. This was no mere grouping. It was a covenant. He continued. The next segment of the chapter described the psychological rot that infiltrated the bloodlines. Paranoia became the ruling lord in every household. Mirrors were covered, not out of modesty, but because family members feared their reflections would whisper the truth of their lineage. Portraits were destroyed, burned, or mutilated. Servants reported seeing individuals standing in doorways long after they had died, their outlines soft, blurred, as though the bloodline was still deciding what shape to give them. House Ilsen's final matriarch locked herself inside a tower for 21 years, convinced that something was growing inside the walls, a version of her, but starved, hungering for her life, her breath, her identity. House Ferrodin employed surgeons to correct deformities that reappeared every generation, elongated limbs, mismatched eyes, uncanny symmetries, voices that spoke in harmonics. House Belrive sealed its entire genealogy after 3 generations were born without a distinction of features, their faces smooth, pale, nearly identical, as if the bloodline had become a single individual reproducing itself endlessly. Cashin's pulse throbbed like a hammer in his throat. He read, "Blood remembers what is given to it, and it takes more than it returns." A soft sound stirred in the dark behind him, a touch of movement. Cassian did not turn. He read on. The manuscript now descended into its most disturbing portion, the disappearances, not of heirs or servants, but of entire wings of noble keeps. One winter morning, the eastern wing of House Veon was simply gone, reduced not to rubble, not burned, but erased as though it had never been built. Inside the empty space, the earth was untouched. Snow lay pristine. The ground showed no sign of foundation stones. Castle Marrowcrest's southern tower vanished similarly. Witnesses said the wall rippled like water, then folded inward. The screams within were cut short, swallowed as the stones sealed themselves. Cashin's breath hitched. A note scribbled in the margin read, "The house consumes its own." He felt a pulse of dread. Was the codex referring to the family or the building itself? He read on. Rumors spread across Europe that certain noble estates were not homes, but living organisms, Parasitic structures grown from the lineage they imprisoned. Some keeps changed layout overnight. Some grew new corridors. Some walls bled when touched. Some doors led to rooms that had never existed until the moment they were opened. The codex described accounts from terrified servants, footprints on ceilings, voices speaking in perfect imitations of the master, children seen walking through walls, portraits aging backward. One entry read, "The bloodline bends a body. The body bends a house. The house bends reality." Cassian felt something tighten around his ribs, as though invisible fingers pressed in. He swallowed hard. The next page contained no text, only a single painted image. A noble family, unnamed, posed for a portrait, but the faces were blurred. Not obscured, not damaged. Blurred as if the painter's brush could not catch their shapes before they changed. Their eyes, however, remained clear, dark, wide, too aware, looking directly at Cassian. Cassian shoved the page aside. The lantern guttered. He forced himself to breathe evenly. The chapter, mercifully, approached its end. The final entry chronicled the collapse of the 12 noble houses. Their keeps were abandoned. Their names erased from official histories. Their bloodline said to have died out. But the scribe disagreed. Cassian read the final lines aloud, voice barely above a whisper. "The 12 do not die. They retreat. They thin themselves like ink in water. They enter other houses, other names, other bodies, until lineage forgets, but blood remembers." The manuscript pulsed. A faint outline appeared in the lower margin, drawn in a hand unmistakably different from the previous entries, jagged yet forceful. "The 13th will be born of knowledge, not blood." Cassian's heart stilled. A second line bled into visibility beneath it. "He who reads the lineage becomes its heir." Cassian jerked back from the codex. The shadows around him rippled. He knew that something was standing just behind him, breathing softly, patiently, awaiting recognition. He did not turn. Instead, he snapped the codex shut with trembling fingers. The breathing stopped. Silence flooded the room. Then, with a dread he felt in every bone, Cassian opened the manuscript again, because he had no choice. The next chapter glowed with fresh ink, as though written just for him. "Free, the Sylvestribus Noctis, of the night dances of the woods." The shadows leaned in, listening, always listening. The forest beyond St. Mordru had always carried a reputation, whispered along the edges of parish sermons and tavern gossip. Even in the Abbey's prime, monks avoided its borders, claiming the trees grew too close together, their branches braiding into patterns that resembled rib cages. When the wind blew, the limbs scraped against each other with a sound like bones rattling during a procession to the damned. Peasants swore the forest was older than the church, older than the noble families, older even than the roads that pretended to tame the land. Cassian, lantern trembling in his grip, stared at the freshly revealed chapter and felt the weight of the forest pressing through the page. "Free, the Sylvestribus Noctis, of the night dances of the woods." A line beneath, written in luminous ink that pulsed faintly like living tissue. "Where bodies hid in veils, others hid in masks." The air around him dimmed, as if the scriptorium itself leaned closer to hear. He began to read. The chapter opened not with text, but with a painting spanning both pages. Under a swollen full moon, masked figures circled a clearing ring by ancient oaks. Their masks were carved from bark, horn, bone, clay, some shaped like animals, others like distorted human faces stretched into inhuman symmetry. The bodies were draped in loose cloth, leaves, or nothing more than shadows, their forms blurred not by modesty but by the frenetic motion of trance. The artist had rendered the mid-movement, limbs extended, backs arched, masks tilted skyward as if awaiting divine judgment or predation. The moon's light reflected strangely on the clearing, forming concentric rings like ripples around a stone cast into water. Cassian traced the painted lines, feeling an odd heat blooming beneath the paper. He turned to the next page. The chapter began. When the church sealed the body, the forest unsealed the spirit. Cassian inhaled sharply. This was no Christian chronicle. It was older, more primal. The text described rites outlawed by kings and bishops alike, ceremonies performed in moonlit clearings where the boundaries of the self dissolved. No explicit acts were described, but the suggestion of bodies moving as one, guided by pulse and shadow, saturated the prose. The manuscript claimed these rites emerged long before the monasteries, before the noble houses, perhaps before the first words were carved into stone. In the woods, the body was not hidden. In the woods, the body remembered itself. Cassian shifted, uncomfortable with how the words seemed to vibrate through him. The rites were called the night dances, though the original name, written here in runes, was erased by time. Villagers feared them yet were drawn to them, like moths circling a forbidden flame. The dances were said to unleash something within the participants, not wickedness, but truth, stripped bare of roles, names, lineage. Masks were essential, not costumes, identities. A mask does not conceal the face. It frees it. Cassian frowned. The codex elaborated. The masks allowed the dancers to shed their human boundaries and adopt the shapes of spirits, beasts, ancestors, forgotten gods. Under the moon, they were not themselves. They were the forest given voice and movement. The dancers followed no music, no drum, no lyre. The forest itself dictated rhythm, wind through branches, the snap of twigs, the distant call of animals. Dancers moved in spirals, imitating the paths of stars or the coils of serpents. They leapt over fires. They crawled across moss. They circled each other, eyes hidden, breasts exposed. Cassian felt heat crawl along his throat. The chapter hinted that the dancers often induced trance, visions where participants saw themselves running on forelimbs, or growing antlers, or sprouting wings. Some saw themselves splitting into two bodies, merging again, dissolving, reforming. None of this was described in carnal detail. The focus was on transformation, dissolution, the body as vessel and echo. But the church saw none of this nuance. The church saw only heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy. Cassian turned to the next page. The script shifted to a monk's voice, fearful, disgusted, yet fascinated. They danced until they forgot their names. Then the forest named them anew. The monk described witnessing a night dance in secret. He had followed villagers into the woods and watched from behind a dead tree. What he saw shook him. Figures leaping over logs with inhuman agility. Hands shifting like paws. Masks seeming to breathe. Bodies moving in perfect unity without speaking, as though guided by a single shared mind. But what terrified him most were the shadows. He wrote, "The shadows did not belong to the dancers. They moved ahead of them, beside them, through them." Cassian's pulse quickened. Shadows independent of bodies. Shadows dancing. Shadows leading. The monk claimed he fled, but when he reached the village he found 3 dancers who followed him home, not in body, but in shadow. They lingered at the edges of lamplight for days, their shapes flickering across walls, stretching longer, thinner, more hungry. He prayed. He fasted. He slept with a crucifix against his chest. But the shadows grew bolder. One morning, they vanished. Only the faint smell of moss remained. The monk returned to the woods. He was never seen again. Cassian shivered. He turned the page. The manuscript now chronicled several villages known for holding night dances despite church bans. In these places, mass gatherings were sources of both ecstasy and terror. Entire communities participated, from elders to adolescents. The dances often lasted until sunrise, ending only when the first bird's call broke the spell. During the rites, the villagers wore animal skins, horns, feathers, symbols of their chosen forms. They moved as packs, herds, flocks, each group embodying a single creature. No explicit content was given, but the descriptions were charged with a heavy, dark sensuality of movement entwined with instinct, body with ritual, self with environment. Cassian read, "They were not beasts. They were what beasts remembered." But the chapter made clear the dances had consequences. Children born after such rituals were rumored to possess strange traits, eyes that reflected moonlight unnaturally, voices that harmonized with night winds, reflexes sharper than their years. These children were feared, revered, sometimes hidden, sometimes hunted. Cashin's stomach clenched. The text shifted abruptly. Accusations, trials, hunts. The church declared all night dancers to be witches or heretics. Soldiers patrolled forests on ritual nights. Torches replaced moonlight. Steel replaced masks. Many dancers fled deeper into the woods. Some fought. Some vanished into thin air as if swallowed by the night itself. And some returned. Cassian leaned closer. Returned not as themselves. When the fires came, the forest chose who would remain human and who would remain a shadow. Spectral revenants were reported across Europe in the century following the purges. Villagers claimed to see masked shapes wandering the woods long after the dancers who wore those masks were executed. Shadows drifted independently of their trees. Voices of the dead whispered from hollow logs. At night, children heard footsteps in their rooms, soft, padded, like paws circling a nest. Cassian swallowed. One account described a nobleman who hanged 6 villagers for participating in night dances. In the weeks following the executions, he was tormented by visions of antlered silhouettes standing at the edges of torchlight. His dogs refused to enter the courtyard. His wife dreamed of vines wrapping around the bedposts. On the night of the next full moon, he disappeared. Only his boots remained, filled with soil and leaves. Cashin's breath shuddered. He felt something stir behind him. A draught, a rustle, as though something unseen had drifted between shelves. He did not turn. He read on. The final portion of the chapter chronicled the last great night dance before the purges extinguished the practice almost entirely. It took place in a forest called the Elderwold, known for trees older than recorded history. Hundreds gathered. Masks gleamed under a blood-red moon. Bodies writhed in spirals. Shadows merged and separated like smoke. The manuscript described the ritual in feverish detail, not explicit, but visceral, pulsing, filled with primal tension. The dancers moved as though the forest itself possessed them. The ground shifted. Roots writhed. Branches bent inward like ribs enclosing a womb. Then, a tremor, a silence. A column of pale light pierced the clearing, and every dancer froze. Cashin's heart hammered as he read. Something rose from the earth. Not a beast, not a spirit, not a human. Something that was all of them and none of them. A mass of masks, limbs, shadows, and breath, swirling like a storm confined to flesh. It spoke without words, and every dancer heard it in their bones. What it said was not transcribed. But every witness who survived fled the Elderwold and never danced again. The church burned the forest within the year, but some said the fire only freed what lived beneath. The revenants multiplied. Villagers vanished. Wolves howled human syllables. The manuscript ended with a final chilling line. The forest remembers every dance, and waits for the next. Cassian exhaled shakily. He felt eyes on him. He looked up. In the corner of the scriptorium, half hidden in shadow, stood a figure wearing a mask of bark and horn. Unmoving, watching. Cassian blinked, and it was gone. He snapped his gaze back to the codex just as the next chapter bled into view, ink appearing as though written by an invisible hand. For the vulnerary sancto of the sanctified wound. The shadows drew closer, listening, always listening. The ink on the next chapter seemed fresh despite the centuries. It shimmered like coiled smoke, rising from the page in thin threads that dissolved into the air before Cashin's blinking eyes. The title was written in a script he had not seen elsewhere in the manuscript, something angular, almost carved rather than inked. The vulnerary sancto of the sanctified wound. A chill crawled up his arms. The letters felt as though they had been carved into the parchment with a trembling hand, a hand that believed itself guided by something beyond flesh. The scriptorium's air thickened, tasting faintly of iron. Cassian began to read. The chapter opened with a confession. Pain was the first prayer. Blood, the first scripture. Below the words was an illustration of a woman kneeling in a stone cell, her hair a tangled halo, her arms raised. Light poured from wounds along her forearms, not blood, but luminous threads drifting upward like incense smoke. Her expression was serene, almost tender. Cassian touched the edge of the illustration. The illumination was too detailed. The artist had captured something beyond technique, the trembling intensity of devotion so total it devoured everything else: hunger, selfhood, fear. He turned the page. The manuscript chronicled the rise of a sect of medieval mystics who believed that suffering purified the soul, tearing open the membrane between mortal flesh and divine presence. These mystics were not formally canonized. Their practices, though whispered of in monastic corridors, were formally condemned. Yet their influence spread through Europe like fever dreams carried on night winds. The sect was known as the Choir of the Wound. Cassian whispered the name. The shadows seemed to hiss it back. The choir believed wounds were portals, apertures through which divine vision could enter body, not wounds inflicted in cruelty, nor in debauchery, but in devotion. Small cuts, burns, fastings, deprivation of sleep until the self split like bark under frost. The manuscript stated, "To open the body is to open the spirit." Cassian bristled. The phrasing echoed a sentiment he had read in the previous chapters. Here, however, the imagery shifted inward, not toward the merging of bodies, but toward revelation through suffering. He continued. The mystics recorded their visions obsessively, scrolls, murals, carvings scratched into walls of hermit cells. They described seeing staircases spiraling into suns, angels with hollow faces, rivers made of sighs, the Virgin weeping tears of burning glass, churches built from bone and moonlight, Christ not crucified, but dissolving into radiance. Some mystics fasted until they saw their own bodies flicker. Others whispered hymns until voices not their own joined them. Some walked barefoot through winter forests, claiming they followed invisible footsteps left by saints. Their practices escalated slowly, turning from symbolic gestures into ecstatic extremes. The manuscript was careful, not explicit, not prurient, yet the descriptions pulsed with intensity, the way a fevered body pulses beneath a shroud. The text read, "In suffering, the flesh melts. In melting, it reveals the divine beneath." Cassian swallowed hard. A paragraph followed describing Annalisa Turan, a mystic whose visions were so frequent that nobles traveled miles to witness her ecstasies. She lived in a single room of a ruined tower, where she would fall into trances lasting days. Her body hardly moved during these states except to shudder, breathe in fits, and occasionally murmur words no one recognized. Her followers believed her wounds produced sacred light, though the manuscript did not confirm this. It stated only, her body became a scripture her voice could not speak. Cassian felt the room tilt slightly. He turned the page. The manuscript now shifted tone, becoming harsher, sharper, filled with the desperation of those who feared divine silence. It described the Feast of Thorns, a ritual in which mystics knelt on brambles, praying until their skin bloomed into raw flowers of pain. The ritual was believed to replicate Christ's crown of thorns, not in imitation, but in longing, as though through their own laceration they might taste the memory of his suffering. The text insisted. This was not martyrdom. It was union. Cassian's breath shortened. The language felt fevered, almost frantic. Several pages were dedicated to an occurrence known as the Midnight Bloom, in which 9 mystics collapsed simultaneously during a solstice vigil. Witnesses claimed their bodies seemed to glow, not from fire or lanterns, but with a strange pale blue luminescence, illuminating the chapel floor in trembling halos. Their eyes rolled back. Their mouths moved. Their fingers stretched toward the rafters as though plucking fruit from invisible branches. They spoke of seeing. A cathedral suspended upside down in the sky. A choir of faceless beings chanting through their wounds. A heart encircled by serpents. A man of light carving stars into his arms with a blade of wind. A great door opening within their ribs, through which a figure stepped into them. Cassian's skin prickled. The witnesses fled. The mystics remained on the floor until dawn. The text concluded. Each awoke with a mark upon their chest. Not a wound, A door. Cassian hesitated before turning the next page. His fingers felt numb. The chapter now explored the church's response to the Choir of the Wound. Publicly, the clergy condemned the sect, calling its practices dangerous deviations and unhealthy obsessions. But privately, secretly, the manuscript alleged that certain bishops, abbots, and nuns practiced their own variations of sacred torment. Some believed suffering summoned visions. Others believed it summoned power. Some believed it summoned companions. The Codex recorded this without judgment. One account described a bishop whose prayers grew so fervent they left scorch marks on the stone around him. He claimed angels visited him during his nightly austerities, angels with bodies made of fire and wings of shadow, whose voices rang like metal shaking inside a furnace. He constructed a small reliquary of his own cast-off garments, dried tears, and scraps of cloth stained from his devotions. Pilgrims claimed the reliquary hummed softly when touched. Relics may bind holiness, but they may also bind what holiness leaves behind. Cassian's pulse thudded in his ears. The manuscript described at least 3 instances where mystics' bodies were kept after death, not because they were saints, but because their flesh seemed unwilling to decay. Their remains exuded strange scents: roses, burning cedar, salt water, sometimes blood as sweet as honey. Church authorities ordered these bodies hidden. Some were entombed beneath chapels. Some were burned. Some were sealed in iron coffins and lowered into rivers during midnight rites. Yet rumors persisted that even after burial, their bodies shifted positions inside their tombs, as though adjusting themselves toward divine comfort or divine hunger. Cassian shuddered. He read on. Near the end of Part 1, the text became dreamlike, its letters blurring at the edges, as though written by a hand trembling from either ecstasy or exhaustion. It described the deepest taboo, the opening of the 9th vein. No explicit description was given, only metaphor, imagery, and fevered interpretation. The 9th vein was believed to be the point where the boundary between flesh and spirit thins to a thread. Opening it was said to cause visions so intense they bordered on possession. Those who attempted it often spoke afterward in strange voices. Some wept for hours. Some laughed. Some could no longer distinguish their own memories from the visions they saw. A few simply whispered, "I have touched him." Cassian's throat tightened as he reached the last paragraph of the section. It read, "Suffering was never the goal. It was a doorway, and once opened, what entered did not always leave." Cassian exhaled, trembling. Behind him, something creaked, soft, deliberate, as though someone shifted their weight to better listen. He did not turn. He closed his eyes and braced himself for Part 2. Cassian steadied his hands as he turned the page. The parchment felt warm, as though the previous reader's fever had seeped into it. The ink shimmered faintly, no longer black but a deep garnet, like diluted blood pressed thin onto vellum. The chapter continued with no preamble. The vision does not end when the eyes close. It ends when the wound closes. Cassian felt his pulse falter for a beat. The text described how members of the Choir of the Wound entered states between death and life, half collapse, half illumination. These ecstatic trances left them suspended on the edge of consciousness, their minds wandering into realms beyond the waking world. This was not framed as sanctity or madness, but as simple passage, a bridge made of breath, trembling flesh, and unbearable devotion. The manuscript explained that the most devout mystics trained themselves to remain in these thresholds for hours, sometimes days. To suffer is to listen. To listen is to learn. Cassian ran his thumb along the margin. The parchment was cool again. He read on. The text chronicled a phenomenon known as a red solace, in which entire groups of mystics would experience synchronized trances. During the red solace, they would lie upon the floor, heads touching in a circle, their breaths rising and falling as one. Witnesses said the air above them rippled as though with heat, even in the dead of winter. The choir believed that during these collective states, their spirits braided together. They claimed to speak with a single voice, hear with a single ear, feel with a single heart. One chronicler wrote, "They were many, yet they suffered as one, and in that unity they felt him breathe." Cassian swallowed. The air around him seemed to echo with that single breath. The manuscript then describes several individuals who became legends among the mystics. Mary Bell of Costello, who claimed she saw the world inverted during her trances, sky beneath her feet, earth above her head, angels walking with their faces turned inward like blooming flowers. Brother Lucent, who lay motionless for 3 days in a narrow cell without food or water. When he rose, he spoke of walking through a cathedral whose walls were made of ribs. Light seeped through the bone as though stained glass. He claimed to have heard God whispering through the marrow. Helena the Ashen, who pressed her palms against a cold iron altar until they blistered, then prayed through the pain until the skin cooled again. Those who tended to her said the blisters formed patterns resembling script, words no one recognized, yet all felt compelled to kneel before. Cassian felt as if the shadows themselves leaned in to read over his shoulder. He turned the page quickly. The text shifted again, its voice more urgent, almost pleading. It described how church officials grew increasingly alarmed by the rising number of mystics. Some prelates feared the sect's influence over the common folk, who came to see visions and suffering as proof of divine favor rather than discipline or penance. The manuscript relayed an incident in which a group of villagers surrounded a mystic cell and refused to disperse until they had witnessed her enter trance. When she did, swaying, eyes rolled back, murmuring in an unrecognizable tongue, they fell to their knees in awe. The bishop condemned them. The villagers ignored him. The codex wrote, authority demanded obedience. Ecstasy demanded surrender. This tension worsened when relic cults emerged around mystics who died during ecstatic states. Their bodies became revered not for martyrdom, but for their luminous, uncanny stillness. Some corpses were said to remain warm for days. Others exuded faint glows at night. Cassian's spine tightened. The manuscript noted that one such relic, the hand of blessed Torben, allegedly moved on its own. A visiting deacon claimed he saw the fingers twitch as though writing in the air. When he approached, the hand stilled. He fled the chapel that night and never returned. Cassian exhaled slowly. He read on. The chapter now veered into the darkest portion yet, a phenomenon known as the second voice. Mystics who cross a certain threshold in their ecstatic practices claim to hear a voice within themselves, not the voice of God, nor of angels, nor of demons. Something else. Something that sounded like their own voice, but elevated, stretched, resonant. The text described it as the voice of the wound, through which something spoke back. The second voice was neither command nor comfort. It was revelation in its rawest form. Flashes of meaning, glimpses of impossible architecture, sensations of standing in multiple places at once. Some mystics believed the voice came from a divine realm. Others believed it came from the wound itself. A few whispered that it came from something waiting on the far side of suffering. The manuscript avoided judgment. It simply recorded. One mystic wrote, "It spoke my name from behind my ribs. I answered without opening my mouth." Cassian's vision darkened at the edges. He blinked hard and forced himself to continue. The Codex recounted the tale of the Chapel of Teeth, a small sanctuary in the kingdom of Leon where mystics secluded themselves during their final rites. The chapel earned its name from bizarre architecture, its doorway lined with curved stones resembling molars. Inside, carvings of open mouths adorned the pillars, as though the building itself longed to swallow the faithful. Here, mystics underwent a ritual called the unbinding. The details were veiled beneath metaphor, but the outcome was clear. Those who completed the unbinding often spoke in the second voice permanently. Their eyes no longer focused on earthly things. They moved with slow, deliberate gestures, as though guided by invisible hands. Some lived for years this way, some for hours, some for seconds. Those who died during or after unbinding became relics immediately. Their bodies cooled but did not decay. Their faces bore expressions of profound serenity, as though they had seen something so magnificent that death itself felt like reprieve. Cassian shivered. He felt as though the scriptorum shadows stretched toward him with silent yearning. He pressed on. Near the end of the chapter, the manuscript turned prophetic. Its words sharpened, the script growing more jagged, as if written in haste, or terror. It spoke of mystics whose visions turned catastrophic. They described seeing the sun bleeding, a staircase descending into a pit of stars, a colossal figure sitting on the horizon, its body made of wounds stitched together, a choir of faceless beings humming a sound that made reality tremble, a book bound in skin, carried by a wandering archivist. Cassian froze. His blood ran cold. The text continued. The sanctified wound is not a path upward. It is a path inward, toward the hollow place where the divine once dwelled. He inhaled sharply, and if the wound opens too far, something else may step through. The next page was blank except for a single line written in a different hand, shaky, frantic, as though the writer fled immediately after inscribing it. Beware the archivist who reads too deeply. Cassian's breath caught. Something moved behind him, soft, almost affectionate, like a fingertip trailing across stone. He did not turn. The final page of the chapter revealed itself slowly, ink seeping into existence as though freshly written. 6. The Alchemical Conjunction of the Alchemical Union. The shadows shifted. The air thickened, and Cassian understood, with dread hollowing his chest, that whatever listened did not wish for the wounds of the past to remain closed. The air in the scriptorium seemed to warp as Cassian opened the next chapter. The ink formed slowly this time, blooming across the page like veins spreading through translucent skin. A faint scent of sulfur gathered beneath his nose, sharp, metallic, and strangely sweet, the unmistakable perfume of ancient alchemical processes. The title manifested in shimmering strokes. The Alchemical Conjunction of the Alchemical Union. Cassian felt an unease coil deep within his ribs. The chapter did not begin with illustrations or historical dates. It began with a warning. Where the mystic sought transcendence through the wound, the alchemist sought it through union. Both reached toward the same light. Both burned. A flicker of motion, barely perceptible, stirred at the edge of his vision. The shadows along the far wall lengthened, as if leaning closer to witness the folly of those long-dead adepts. Cassian adjusted the lantern. The shadows did not recede. He continued reading. The manuscript recounted the rise of a clandestine order known as the Conjunti, a sect of alchemists who believed the transformation of metals was merely a metaphor. Gold, mercury, sulfur, they were symbols, not goals. The true magnum opus lay within the human body. The Conjunti believed every soul was an incomplete fragment of a greater cosmic whole. Humans were imperfect vessels, half-formed echoes of a primordial union shattered at the dawn of creation. The alchemists claimed this fracture explained the universal ache, the longing that haunted kings and beggars alike. To repair this fracture, they sought conjunction, a merging not of flesh alone, but of essence, breath, memory, and spirit. Cassian's breath grew shallow as he read the next line. Those who united their essences could create a single soul greater than either half. It sounded like mysticism, like fable, but the tone of the manuscript carried none of the mystic's ecstatic fever. This was cold, analytical, methodical. The Conjunti approached the soul with instruments, equations, furnaces, diagrams etched with circles interlocking like clasped hands or interwoven ribs. Their laboratories were hidden, beneath abandoned chapels, inside ruined castles, under the foundations of cities still thriving above. Some built their workshops in deep forests where smoke would vanish into fog. Others worked in catacombs, where the dead might remain silent witnesses. Cassian turned the page. The illustration awaiting him made his stomach knot. A circular room, walls lined with shelves of glass vessels containing pale, swirling vapors. Two figures seated cross-legged within a chalk mandala, their bodies leaning toward one another, foreheads touching. Between them, a thin thread-like substance, neither smoke nor light, stretched from one mouth to the other, binding them. Below the illustration, the script read, "To merge the breath is to merge the being." Cassian exhaled. His breath felt suddenly noticeable. The manuscript described the earliest attempt at alchemical union. They began modestly, the sharing of breath, mirrored meditations, harmonizing heartbeats, techniques to synchronize the rhythm of two bodies until their pulses aligned, echoing one another. At first, these rituals produced nothing but faint dizziness and hallucinations attributed to incense or exhaustion. But over time, practitioners reported sensations that defied explanation, memories shared between those with no prior connection, dreams identical in imagery, waking visions in which the other's thoughts murmured faintly beneath their own. The feeling of occupying two bodies at once. One adept wrote, "I saw through his eyes as through a window, and he saw through mine. Our minds braided." Another recorded, "When he lifted his hand, I felt my fingers rise." Cassian felt his own fingers twitch involuntarily. The Konyangtai considered these small successes. They sought more. The manuscript's tone grew darker, more clinical. The experiments intensified. Alchemists attempted to distill the essence of the participants. Breath captured in bell jars, hair burned to release smoke, blood allowed to congeal in crucibles beside shards of quartz. They believed each bodily element contained a fragment of the inner soul, and that by blending these elements they could fuse the individuals who supplied them. The text described no gore, no explicit detail, only process, theory, ritual arrangement. Everything was framed as sacred inquiry. The results, however, were far from divine. Some participants fell into prolonged trances, muttering in languages unknown to them. Some could no longer distinguish their own memories from those of their partner. Some refused to return to their original names, claiming they had become something new, something singular. One pair insisted they could feel each other's heartbeats from across a room. Another couple vanished entirely.